Welcome everyone to this very exciting talk on Khmer monks in India, 𝐀𝐻𝐿 Pañño, Sophal, and Mutable National Identities, presented by Professor John A. Marston. I'm delighted and honored to be invited by the Center for Khmer Studies, and especially thanks to Professor John Marston. I'm Napakadon Kitiseni, or go by it if you will. I am currently a doctoral candidate at the Department of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So first of all, I would like to introduce our speaker today. Actually, for those who are in the Khmer Studies Circle, wouldn't need me to introduce, but I love a ritual, and I love to conduct a ritual. So please allow me to spend a few minutes to introduce our esteemed speaker for today. So Dr. John Marston is a professor researcher at the Center for Asian and African Studies of El Colegio de México in Mexico City. He completed a doctorate in anthropology at University of Washington, Seattle in 1997. And he also was a CKS Scholar-in-Residence Fellow last year in 2023. He has published 3 edited volumes on Cambodia and the anthropology of Southeast Asia, namely History, Buddhism, and New Religious Movements in Cambodia, published by University of Hawaii Press. This is, I would say, co-edited by Elizabeth Guthrie. This is a seminal work in Khmer studies. And also Anthropology and Community in Cambodia by Monash University Press, which is a kind of revisiting the earlier ethnography by May A. Bihara. And the next volume is Ethnicity, Borders, and the Grassroots Interface with the State, published by Silkworm Books, as well as numerous articles in books and scholarly journals. A collection of his articles, Budismo y sociedad en Sureste de Asia, was published by El Colegio de México in 2020. And on a personal note, as today the topic is about Buddhism, and in Buddhism we care, especially in the Theravada school, we care so much about lineage. I would also acknowledge that I first learned about Professor John Marston's work through my MA advisor, Ratana Tosapun, whose mentor also the same person as Professor John Marston, which is the late Professor Charles F. Skies, who's one of the most celebrated anthropologists of mainland Southeast Asia and also Theravada Buddhism. So without further ado, I would like to turn the floor to Professor John Marston. And for the practical question, we would have about 45 minutes for the presentation, followed by the Q&A. So for those attendees who want to ask questions, please feel free to put in the Q&A box. And in case you want to speak with our speaker today, and I'm sure some of you will, so please use the raise hand function during the Q&A session so that we can unmute you and allow you to speak with the speaker. All right. So I would love to turn the floor to Professor John Marston.
Okay, well, thank you, 𝐀𝐻, so much. And it's great to be here at CKS. I've had a long affiliation with CKS over quite a few years. And last year, I had the opportunity to be a CKS Scholar-in-Residence. For 6 months, I was based in Siem Reap, and my purpose at that time was to work on my book. This is the long-term project about Cambodian monks who were in India, who initially went there before 1975. And this is what I'll be talking about today, although I'll be focusing on 2 specific monks. Maybe I can start sharing my PowerPoint here. Okay, So I'm going to be talking today about these two monks, and they have, well, in the case of Mahaprasud, there were, which I've spelled wrong here, he went by various names, and so it actually, I see the title I gave was 𝐀𝐻𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐜𝐭, Pañño, which was his name. It was also a monastic name, but he became known as Mahaprasud while he was in India, and Mutable. And but just to put this in the context of my larger project, I'm looking at groups of Cambodian monks, cohorts of Cambodian monks, or I should say Khmer monks, because some of them, which is the topic today, were ambiguously from Cambodia itself. And so I've identified 34 names of Khmer monks who were in India in this period. And inevitably, we focus on the most famous ones. And these are Mahaghosananda and Dharmavar Mahathera. And in Cambodia now, most people will know who Mahaghosananda was. And although not all people know that he'd studied in India, and that a very formative period of his life was in India. And this is part of what I've concerned. Dharmavar Mahathera is less known, partly because he left. He was in India back in the 1930s. There was a period of time when he was going back to Cambodia in the 1950s and had regular contact with Sihanouk. This is a topic I've written about in a published paper. But in a way, he wasn't in Cambodia so much. And so, but he had fame because he had Western followers. And so I've tried to avoid focusing too much on these two monks, who are the most famous monks, although inevitably I go back to them because there's so much more material about them than the others. But today I'm going to talk about two other monks who are much less famous. Except for a few of you who studied in India, or you probably have never even heard of these monks. And yet I find them very interesting. They are important to my research, and yet ultimately what my project from the beginning was not to look just at them, but to look at all of these monks, all these Khmer monks who were in India before the Pol Pot period, and look at their lives. How did their lives play out, even in the period after the Pol Pot period? And my purpose is not to write a heroic biography. And I was interested in, this is a trend in academic studies. It's not really new anymore, but to shift the focus from the center to the periphery. And so the center, of course, would be monks like Junat and Hu That, who were sort of the founders of Cambodian national Buddhism as we think of it today. But a certain school of studies says, well, let's not just look at the center, let's look at the peripheries. And so we became interested, especially in border crossings, in the place where the line between what is Cambodian and what is not Cambodian is not so clear. And what I found in other people's scholarship and in my own is that if you do this, sometimes you begin to see things you didn't see otherwise. And the focus is less on the national narrative than on a human process, where we can see individual people sort of finding their way in the larger context of historical processes and life worlds. I've also been interested, since I was a doctoral student, in the work of Pierre Bourdieu, and Pierre Bourdieu is interested in how categories that we assume are true, like especially interested in kinship categories, that in actual practice, these are often open to negotiation. and even categories like Khmer or Thai or Vietnamese are, in practice, in certain situations, these are open to negotiation. These are things that are not for everybody completely clear cut. And so what interests me in the two monks I'm going to be talking about today is that these are monks who were not clear cut Cambodian. In the case of Dapper Sud, he had Thai citizenship. He was from Battambang, and as a young man went to Thailand. It was from Thailand as a Thai citizenship that he went to India. And the other monk, Sophal, was Khmer Crown. That is to say, he was ethnic Khmer from Vietnam. And so they are going to India with as in some sense Khmer, but as in some sense with an identity which is not so clear. And so we see a situation where they are the word we keep using is negotiating. They're negotiating their way, where identity is not always clear cut. In the anthropology and sociology of religion, there tends to be two directions. That there's a scholarly tradition about religion as something communal, and there's a scholarly tradition of religion as something individual, an individual pursuit of salvation or some other spiritual path. And some scholars have even said that, well, religions can be divided into religions that are more communal and religions that are salvation religions. And I've always thought that division was artificial. And so, of course, here we're talking about individual biographies. And so obviously what we're talking about is something individual. But I'm interested in how the individual also relates to communal processes, communal identity, which is itself in flux and in a process of negotiation. Okay, let's go on to, well, quickly, I'm not sure if this is the point to put these two pictures on the screen, but I introduced these two other characters who both were originally monks when they went from Cambodia to India, and then eventually left the monkhood. And they were both still living the first time I went to India. And the man on the right, 𝐀𝐻𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐜𝐭, is still living. And I've been able to interview him on 3 occasions, most recently in February of this year. And I post their picture because they've been important for this process. It was actually my conversation with them the first time I went to Cambodia that got me interested in this topic. And just to point out that to what extent I rely on interviews for this whole process. And there've been many, many other people I've been interviewing as well. Here's other pictures of them that I took. And then I'm going to point to this book, which the first time actually I heard about Dapper Sud, I heard that there was a book about him, a cremation volume. Actually, it was originally written at the time of the Bajosema, the boundary ceremony of the Cambodian temple, and then it was republished at the time of Dapper Sud's death. And this is a book that I knew existed from the beginning, but people said they couldn't find it, and perhaps they just didn't want me to, or afraid if they shared it with me, I would steal it or something. But I want to thank Khat Bunthon. Khat Bunthon is a former monk who studied in India. Now he works at Cambodian Development Resource Institute, and he has also had an interest in these same themes. And I want to I've drawn heavily from this book, which I finally got a copy of. And I especially want to thank Kat Bunton for helping me access this book, which was extremely helpful. So, okay, let's get going on talking about these individual monks. And I'll try. There's a lot of ground to cover, and I'll be mostly reading here. Pañño, and he was born Chun Bran, who would become to know as Lokda Mahaprasut, or Lokda Asai Mahaprasut, was born in 1918 in Mong Rasai district of Battambang to a poor family, the fourth of 7 children. He was 5 years younger than Mahagosananda, so his career as a monk is much closer than that of Dharmavara, if we see it as playing out in relation to the historical development of Buddhism and world events. He ordained as a novice at Wat Phnom Athapadai in his home district at the age of 15, and went to study at Wat Kaw near the provincial town, returning to Mong to ordain as a bhikkhu at the age of 21. His study at Wat Kaw continued. He went to study in Bangkok in 1940. Not long after becoming a bhikkhu, brought along with 2 other young monks by his teacher. He would be resident there until 1957, the year of the Thai Buddhist Jayanti celebrations. His decision to study in Thailand was consistent with the historical tradition of Cambodian monks going to Thailand to study, an attraction that doubtless continued to be felt even as the French, to counter it, opened a Pali school and established a Buddhist institute with the goal of countering this trend. Battambang, a principality in a tributary relation to Siam, prior to 1907, would have had particularly strong ties to Thai Buddhism. Prasut went to Thailand during the administration of Prime Minister Pibong Songkhram, when Cambodia was still a French protectorate, at a time when the Japanese were beginning to negotiate a military presence in both Siam and French Indochina. 1940 was also the year when, with Japanese encouragement, territorial fighting broke out between the Thais and the French. And in 1941, with Japanese support, the Thais would take control of Battambang for the rest of World War II. The national organization of the Thai monkhood was given greater structure in the Sangha Acts of 1902 and 1941, the latter enacted soon after Prasut's arrival in Thailand, which defined ecclesiastic hierarchy and its relation to Thai government. Based in a major Bangkok Wat, he would have progressed in his religious studies at the heart of the Thai Buddhist organization. His Thai citizenship was probably given under these circumstances. He was resident at Wat Po. Wat Po, of course, is one of the essential Buddhist temples if you visit Thailand, if you visit Bangkok. And he completed his Pali studies to the Prayok 4th level. This shows considerable scholarship and actually a higher level than Dharmavara was said to have achieved in Siam. His biography states that he traveled and preached throughout different parts of Thailand and also taught Pali there. It's notable that Prasut went from Thailand to India during the year of the Buddha Jayanti celebrations. That is to say, the 2500th anniversary of the Buddha's enlightenment. At this time, pilgrimage to Buddhist sites was encouraged, and there was much talk in the air of the beginning of a new era. Buddhist leaders from around the world went to India to celebrate festivities in honor of the year 2500 of the Buddhist calendar. Since at least the 1930s, at the time that Lokanatha organized trips with Thai monks, the idea of the revival of Indian Buddhism was widely discussed within Thai Buddhism, along with the fascination with Buddhist sites in India. With Indian independence, Nehru would come to encourage links to neighboring Buddhist countries, and a proposal to India by the Thai monarch resulted in a Thai Buddhist temple being founded in Bodh Gaya in 1956, which we see here in the picture. Giri writes, under the name the Royal Wat Thai, This became the first Buddhist monastery and temple in the post-independence era to be built under the jurisdiction of a foreign head of state. This was a significant affiliation for Prasad in his early years in India. A few years later, another Thai temple, a subsidiary to the one at Bodh Gaya, was founded at Sarnath by a Thai monk named Prakru Prakat Samtikun. I hope I'm getting that name right. Who had taught meditation at Wat Mahatha in Thailand, and he asked Prasad, who by then already knew Hindi, to go there. It became one of his bases until he founded his own temple. A Thai Buddhist scholar who studied in India called Prasad a Dhammatud monk. That is a sort of missionary monk or ambassador of Buddhism. Among his activities in this period was guiding Thai pilgrimage groups visiting sacred sites in India. At this same time, there was a lot of Thai monks as well as Cambodian monks who were going to study in India. Prasad's original purpose in going to India may not have been study, but his arrival can be seen as connected to a general momentum of Thai and other foreign monks going to study in India. His biography states that he completed both a BA and an MA. We know that in the early 1960s, he studied at Sampurnam Sanskrit University in Varanasi. Well, here's a picture of Sampurnam University. It's quite a colorful campus in its own way. He later also studied Jainism for a time at the Prakrit Institute at Vaishali, an institute created like Navanalanda Mahavihara by the Indian government at about the same time as Navanalanda Mahavihara. Well, anyway, according to his biography, he had 7 languages: Khmer, Khmer, Thai, Hindi, Lao, Pali, Sanskrit, and Prakrit. It seems logical to assume that Lokta Prasad was primarily affiliated with the new Thai temple at Bodh Gaya from his first arrival in India, although 𝐀𝐻𝐿 a Khmer ex-monk who since the 80s was something of a right-hand man to Prasad, emphasized his early residence at the Ashoka mission with Dharmavara Mahatera. This is not a particularly good picture of the Ashoka mission, although it was founded by Dharmavara Mahatera, this other Cambodian monk who has been very central to my research, and was a location which was very important for several of the Cambodian monks who went to India. According to ex-monks resident in India, Prasad went to India on a Thai passport and continued to use a Thai passport until he was given a Cambodian passport in the 1990s. Prasad could rightfully claim to be, in some sense, a scholar monk who completed degrees and had considerable mastery of Pali and Prakrit. And this is emphasized by the Thais I interviewed who'd known him. One of the ironies is here is that despite this, most Cambodians who had contact with him in India describe him as a magical monk. In Khmer, a monk who had sakset, identified less with scholarship than with the less scripturally based aspects of religious practice, such as amulets and water blessings, that are some of which are described as being in the Boran tradition, which is another big topic within Cambodian Buddhist studies and Theravada Buddhist studies more general. In my interviews, the earliest recollection of him was from the early 1960s by the sister of a Cambodian diplomat. She recalls going to the Ashoka mission in the early 1960s with a Cambodian embassy maid because the maid wanted to see the magical monk, that is to say, Prasad. 𝐀𝐻𝐿, referring to Prasad's magical spiritual program, I put in quotes magical, speaks of his fortune telling. Although I think what was involved was probably a wider set of esoteric practices. And those of you who are scholars of Theravada Buddhism know that Kate Crosby has, and other scholars have looked very deeply into the whole issue of Baran practices, in which ways that give it a great deal of dignity and consistencies with Buddhism. He practiced sravtak, a type of water blessing believed to give protection or power, a practice closely identified in Cambodia with Baran traditions. Somewhat ironically, Dharmavara, whose healing practices might seem in the same category to many Western observers, saw his own practices as scientific and consistent with Buddhist scriptures, and was distrustful of the Baran practices, which were sometimes interpreted as inconsistent with Buddhist teachings. According to 𝐀𝐻𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐜𝐭, Prasad, even on this basis, advised people not to come to him for these practices, but they did anyway, and he kept performing them. Dharmavara, in his own odd synthesis of Buddhism and naturopathy, treated Indians from the local community and later Westerners. Prasad's practice seems to have been sought by Cambodians and Thai visitors to India. There's probably no way of answering the question of the extent to which Prasad's esoteric practices drew on experience he had as a child or novice in Cambodia, or as a monk in Thailand, or in the study of yoga in India, or to the extent to which his practices grew out of the interaction he had with those who sought him out in India. All these facets of his identity, though, and the ambiguity surrounding them, no doubt, fed the way he was perceived by those who sought his power. Among the stories widely told about Prasad is how he was arrested when he was doing meditation in the area of Rishikesh, near the Himalayas. This was evidently a story which Dr. Prasad enjoyed telling, and there's probably no further documentation of it than the oral record he himself originated, but it is part of the mythos surrounding him. One version of the narrative is that it occurred at the time of the Chinese incursion into India in October and November of 1962. And in fact, 𝐀𝐻𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐜𝐭, recounting the story to me, started by repeating this detail, but then corrected himself since he knew that Prasad was at the Sanskrit University at that time. So we can't really date this. And actually, I'm in conversation with Katmanton yesterday. We saw that there's a document that does say that he was in the Himalayas for more than 2 years, which is quite a long period of time. The story is that Prasad followed the Ganges up into the hills and was meditating in a remote mountainous area. As a non-Indian, perhaps in violation of his visa, he was regarded as a suspicious character and taken into custody by military authorities. He continued to engage in intensive meditation while jailed, and won over to his side the Indian military officers holding him, and was soon allowed to go. Prasad was said to have attained the capacity through meditation to maintain body heat despite extreme cold, and this supernatural obliviousness to temperature may have been part of what so impressed his jailers. According to Pisit Kutsapo, a Buddhist scholar who knew Prasad when he studied in India in the 1980s, there was a competition among the rishis for who could sit in the snow in a hut and practice meditation. Prasad could sit the whole night. When he was released, he asked where he should go, and they sent him by military truck to Gurukul Kangri University in Haridwar, Uttarakhand, some 30 kilometers south of Rishikesh, where the Ganges leaves the Himalayan hills. The professors were surprised to see him and regarded him as a rishi, or forest ascetic. He was invited to all the professors' homes, one after another, staying for a week. It was after this period of intensive meditation that he began to be called Lokta Prasad, and was referred to as a Maharishi, or in Khmer, Da Sai. When I was told the story previously, I assumed that he was engaged in Buddhist meditation. 𝐀𝐻𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐜𝐭 emphasizes that Dr. Prasad was studying yoga at Rishikesh. He practiced vegetarianism at this time and only gradually returned to eating meat. He would continue to practice yoga the rest of his life, but less intensively than he did at this time. I'm going to, I need to start skipping paragraphs. His study at different schools extended at least into the mid-1970s. By the end of 1970s, only 4 of the Cambodian Khmer monks who had come to India remained in the country: Dapar Sud, Moksapal, Sambe, and 𝐀𝐻𝐿. And this is also the significance of these figures, that once most of the Cambodian monks who were in India left in the aftermath of the Pol Pot period, several of them were able to migrate to the United States. The ones who stayed were Dapar Sud and Moksapal, and these two ex-monks who continued, who all of them stayed in India the rest of their lives, basically. From having led pilgrimage groups, Prasad was well acquainted with Sravasti, one of the cities where the Buddha had spent significant time, and one of the most important sacred sites of Buddhism. In 1980, he began to explore the possibility of building a temple there and purchased a mango grove for this purpose in 1982. It was on the main highway near the road leading to the principal Buddhist archaeological site. The temple became operational by 1986. It was considered a Thai temple and received support over many years from the government of Thailand, and in particular Wat Po in Bangkok. It was at that time one of only 3 international temples at Sravasti, along with a Chinese and Sri Lankan temple. Along the model of the Buddhist temples at Bodh Gaya, and less so than the model of the Ashoka Mission, the principal function of the temple was housing visiting pilgrimage tourist groups. Although, like other temples, it served as short or long-term residence for Thai and Cambodian monks and lay persons or other members of the Buddhist community. In the 1980s, Cambodians from diaspora communities in Western countries began coming to India to tour sacred sites, perhaps sometimes joining Thai tour groups, and he doubtless began meeting with them, as well as Cambodians from the country itself, including diplomats. He developed a strong connection to Sophal, the ambassador to India in 1985 to 1988, later chief of the Cambodian Council, minister to one of the most powerful political figures in Cambodia. He would later have a strong connection to another Cambodian ambassador, Vuk Pang, during whose tenure he received a Cambodian diplomatic passport with the help, according to 𝐀𝐻𝐿, Sophal. It was Vuk Pang who wrote the booklet about, this booklet about Dapar Sud. This is the temple in Sravasti. The Cambodian diplomatic passport obtained in the 1990s doubtless factored in the fact that his activities in India came to be identified with Cambodia rather than Thai Buddhism. In 1992, Cambodia had already signed the Paris Peace Agreements, which would result in a United Nations mission to the country and internationally supervised elections, all changing significantly the political economic foundation of the country. It created, among other things, more and more possibilities for travel and cultural exchange between Cambodia and India. Dapar Sud would, in 1994, go on to found a temple on the outskirts of Delhi called Wat Khorodat Kaimararam. It's in Chhatapur, which, and it would eventually be identified as a Cambodian temple. The temple buildings at what was formerly a medical clinic were purchased for the equivalent of US $300,000. Building of a vihar began in 1996, and there was a sacred boundary ceremony in the year 2000, 2 years before Prasud's death. Artisans were brought from Cambodia to ensure that the style of the vihar would be authentic, and the total cost of the renovations were 6 million Indian rupees. The temple is incorporated by the Indo-Khmer Theravada Buddhist Society of New Delhi, an association recognized by the Indian government. In September 1996, at a ceremony on the occasion of the Cambodian holiday Chumban, with the temple dedicated ritually a large Buddha image donated by the Thai embassy, along with other gifts and furnishing, and Thai, Lao, and Khmer embassy staff present, Basud announced publicly that the food would be regarded as a Cambodian temple and symbolically donated it to the representative of the Cambodian embassy. Perhaps the only Cambodian temple in India to receive this relation with the Cambodian government. This may have been a surprise to the Thai embassy. That same year, the Cambodian embassy donated a used Mercedes car for the use of the temple. Other Cambodian ministers visited the temple when in India on state visits, most notably in February 2000, when Prime Minister Hun Sen and his wife paid a visit to the temple, making a donation of US 2,000. I'm going to have to skip over some things, but Basud died in March 24th, 2002. A special refrigerated casket was shipped to the ward and used to hold his body, and stayed until the time of his cremation in a 3-day ceremony at the end of December of that year, the 2-year anniversary of this SEMA ceremonies dedicating the temple, attended by Cambodian diplomats and Cambodian monks and students resident in India, as well as Khmer monks from France, the United States, Australia, and Canada. His ashes are now in a stupa on the grounds of the New Delhi temple. You can see here in the upper right-hand corner the stupa where his ashes are held. So, and here's some, here's a picture of, it's not very clear, I found this on the internet, of Vuk Tang, who is the Cambodian ambassador to India, and wrote the booklet that I've relied on heavily. And here's some general pictures of Basud. And Basud is really relatively well documented as a monk and as a person. So let's go on to Moksapol, and I'm of course running out of time and have a lot to cover in a short period of time. Moksapol was much more tenuous institutionally than Lokta Basud, although he stands out as one of the few Khmer monks who completed a doctorate in India, and he played a role in founding new Cambodian temples at sacred Indian sites in the 2000s. In common with Mahaprasad, he came to India with an ambiguous national identity, and of the Khmer monks, he was, along with Basud, one of only a handful who remained in India after the mid-1970s. Although he left the monkhood in his late 30s, he never married, and for the rest of his life remained close to Buddhist temples in India and the community surrounding them, linked to them both by deeply ingrained Buddhist beliefs and habits and by the transnationalism the temples represented. Almost exclusively on interviews for what I've learned about him, in particular interviews with a grandnephew, Pet Bani, who helped take care of him in his old age before ordaining as a monk himself, and with Venerable Poi Meta, the founder of the Cambodian temple at Bodh Gaya, where Moksapol was living at the time of his death. And I also rely on interviews with Khelpa Ma, and to some extent with Sambe, we saw in the pictures. Virtually the only archival record I have of Moksapol is his name in a list of international students at Nabanalanda Mahavihara. He was born in Chao Dok. Actually, different sources give different places for where he was born, but I rely here on my interview with his nephew. He was born in 1933, one of 5 children. His father, a soldier in the French colonial military, was ethnic Khmer, and his mother was Vietnamese. He and an older brother, Hoc So Tin, went to Phnom Penh around the time of independence and ordained as novices. The older brother later disrobed and married, working as a guard at the Indian embassy in Phnom Penh. according to Muttable's grandnephew, he stayed at Wat Maham Trai in Phnom Penh. And these are, also I have very few pictures of him. And really the picture of him as a monk on the left, that's the only fairly decent picture I have him at all. And these are, the blurry pictures are from snapshots. I took a picture with my phone from somebody's album. Here, some of you know very well, on the left is Wat Maham Trai in Phnom Penh. Different interviewees give different dates for when he went to India, but we can estimate it being around 1958 or 1959 when Grassroots was already in India, but prior to the dates, we know that Mutable was at Nalanda. According to his grandnephew, Mutable was visiting Preang Dangke, an important spirit shrine on the riverfront of the royal palace, who all Cambodians know. And he was overcome with an overwhelming feeling that he had to leave Cambodia. As the grandnephew tells the story, Mutable left Cambodia without informing his mother in Vietnam and flew to Kolkata, where he knew no one. He somehow had a calling card for Lokda Mahaprasad, whom he'd never met, and was naive enough to think that this large city he was flying to was where he would find Da Prasad. The card meant nothing to the taxi drivers he showed it to, but one kind driver, seeing his robes, brought him to a Buddhist temple, probably the Bauddha Dharma Kursaba, historically important association and Theravada temple serving Bengali Buddhists. He would then go to Varanasi Sanskrit University in Uttar Pradesh, where Da Prasad had also gone. And I eventually studied at Vishwa Bhavati University in Shantinikelan, Western Bengal, a distinguished school founded by Rabindranath Tagore, and completing a BA in English literature. One of very few Khmer monks to have been based in Bengal. At this time, he had minimal financial support, according to Pañño, the equivalent of US $700 from his mother and other supporters. He wrote his mother regularly in Vietnamese and would send her, for example, gifts of Indian cloth. From records at Navanalanda Mahavihar Institute, near the site of the ancient Nalanda University, we know he was a student there in the 1963-64 school year without completing a degree, probably studying Pali. He was at the school at the same time as Gelpa Ma, who recalls him there, and with Mahako Sananda, was a long-term student. In records list his nationality as Cambodian. Gelpa Ma recalls that along with a group of Vietnamese students, he participated in a hunger strike in protest of policies toward Buddhism in Vietnam. And I don't know how much time I have to go in detail in this. There's some confusion about what date, because Gelpa Ma remembered this as occurring in 1963, which is when there was suppression of Buddhism under Siem in South Vietnam. Although it turns out that we do have a press, this hunger strike took place in Calcutta, and there are pictures of it that do not show Mutable, but show two other monks, one of them, another Khmer monk, Tat Hai, who if I had time, I would be talking about as well. And this is dated to 1966. And so without going into the whole history of these protests in Vietnam, they're relating to, he seems to have participated in this protest. Perhaps when he was at Navanalanda Mahavihara, which is or perhaps when he was already in Vaishali. And this whole question of the political involvement is quite interesting to me, and it relates to the whole question of the intellectual atmosphere is affected well as this figure Mahagosananda, who we don't want to exaggerate the politics of Navanalanda Mahavihara, which although the United States accused it of communist infiltration, but this was the 1960s or the 1950s and the 1960s, and it was the Cold War. And as things turned into the 60s and all the tensions of what was going on in Vietnam, students were aware of this as they were elsewhere. And Moxapal was one of the students who had been born in Vietnam, who associated with other Vietnamese students in Navanalanda Mahavihara and participated apparently in these protests. He left Navanalanda Mahavihara to study at the Research Institute of Prakrit Jainology in Ahimsa, 115 kilometers away in Vaishali, perhaps because of the availability of scholarship funding. Moxapal would stay there 12 years, completing first what was regarded as a second-class MA, then a regular MA, then a doctorate. His grandnephew recalls him saying that once he entered the doctoral program, a scholarship of 200 rupees a month allowed him to live relatively comfortably. His doctoral dissertation was entitled Message Poetry with Special Reference to Samdesh Rasaka. Sandesh Sarasaka being an 11th century epic poem in a little-known language. According to Poimita, he left the monkhood at the age of 37, which would be 1970, roughly the halfway point in his studies at Vaishali. His grandnephew stressed how, even after leaving the monkhood, Moxapal continued to live a life much like a monk, a simple life committed to helping people and giving financial help when he could. Kesavan uses the word introverted, which Poimita confirms, adding that hermetic in character, he could be emotional and shift opinions easily, but all stress is great kindness. When Cambodia fell to, I'm going to try to cut this short, that he did, about the time he finished his doctorate, he did apply for resettlement in the United States. Many of the Khmer monks, at the time Cambodia fell to Pol Pot, were able to apply successfully to migrate to the United States as refugees. And Moxapal did apply as well, but was not accepted, perhaps because his passport was Vietnamese instead of Cambodian. After this, he did apply for refugee status. He had refugee status for 15 years, getting $1 a day as a refugee stipend. And he was able to do some work as a translator with Indian customs at the New Delhi airport, and later working for the United Nations. And he seemed to have lived, we don't know, but at times he was living near the Ashoka Mission. There may have been times he lived at Dabrasud's temple in Sravasti. He was sort of in a kind of limbo. My impression is that he was never totally secure, and yet he was attached. He remained connected to temples, Buddhist temples. Then in 1997, 3 years after the Cambodian temple in New Delhi was established, he was invited to live in a Vietnamese Mahayana temple in Bodh Gaya, Vietnam. And this is, you can see here, it's the temple on the left where he stayed first. Later on, he was asked to go to the temple, and by this time he'd acquired Indian citizenship. Then he went to Nepal to be at the Indian temple and the Vietnamese temple in Nepal. It was around this time that he connected with a Cambodian monk, a very young monk then, Hoi Meta, who was itself trying to establish a presence in India. And when Moksapal came back from Nepal, because he wasn't really comfortable there, Hoi Meta suggested that, well, why don't you ordain again as a monk? And he did it this time, ordaining in the Burmese temple in Bodh Gaya. This Hoi Meta had a dream, and maybe it was shared by other Cambodian monks, including 𝐀𝐻𝐿𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐿 Ratana, whose name many of you know, was based in Sri Lanka, but spent some time in Bodh Gaya at this time too. There was discussion visiting sites to create Cambodian temples at Bodh Gaya and other sites in India. And Moksapal was at least part of this process, part of the discussion, he gave his advice about where these temples could be built. And eventually, as an Indian citizenship, he could be part of the trust that enabled these temples to be built. Here is Hoi Meta and a recent flyer of his dated from my research prior to the pandemic, and he has quite a few Cambodian affiliated temples in India at various different stages of completion. And it was partly because Moksapal, as an Indian citizen, could create the trust fund that this was all possible. Hoi Meta says, as a monk in his last years, Moksapal lived a quiet life and practiced meditation intensively, visiting the site of the Buddhist enlightenment almost daily. Cambodians living in India venerated him as the oldest Khmer monk living in India at that time. By this time, Dapasun had died. And he died in 2013 at the age of 79. It's harder than in the case of Mahaprasad to explain why Moksapal's story fascinated me from the first time I heard it. His lifeless, overtly successful, and Dapasun suggests someone often getting by. Only with difficulty, he went to India as a monk without external support and remained a monk for 10 years. Despite the rarity of Theravada robes there, he maintained much of the lifestyle of a monk after disrobing, working various jobs, and often living at Buddhist monasteries, finally reordaining. At the end of his life, he spoke Khmer and Vietnamese, which helped him earn a living and perhaps identified as Vietnamese when joining protests or living in a Vietnamese temple, but may have ultimately been more comfortable at Khmer temples. His life as a border crosser was often not easy, and his livelihood was fragile. He survived while negotiating a narrow path among cultural interstices. So I think I better end now so that we can have some time for question and answer. So I wanted to quickly talk about 3 more Khmer monks, and I'll just show you the pictures. One, this name was named Tat Sung. These I learned about, I got their names from 𝐀𝐿𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐜𝐭. Well, one of them, Tat I'd heard of before, but I got the names of 2 others. When I interviewed 𝐀𝐿𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐜𝐭 in February, and I asked him what other Khmer monks were at Navanalanda Mahavihara. I've been able to learn a little bit about these other monks, although I could not write a full biography of them. Tat Sung is an interesting case because he went back to Vietnam. He was involved in one protest march in Vietnam. I've been able to meet someone thanks to Elizabeth Guthrie's help, and she put me in touch with another 𝐀𝐻𝐭𝐫𝐚 scholar, Tatsé. I was able to get this picture and learn a little about his life. Eventually, he went to the United States, but we don't know that much. Eventually, he left the monkhood. Hat Hai is another 𝐀𝐻𝐿 monk who, as I told you, there was this protest, this hunger strike, the U.S. consulate in Kolkata in 1966, and we have this photo of him, and we have some documents from the U.S. diplomatic cables at the time. Again, it's fascinating because it's this dramatic moment, and apparently 𝐀𝐿 was involved in this protest as well. But we know little about Thai other than that. Some people seem to think he went to Canada, and then Venerable Kem True is a mysterious figure that I've just been learning about, and I've been in touch with various people, and it turns out he's still alive and lives in a temple in California, and has had a very, very distinguished career as a meditation teacher. And the mystery surrounding him is he really 𝐻𝐻𝐿 or not? That he's often identified as Vietnamese. He's clearly very literate in Vietnamese. The website about him, a lot of the literature's in Vietnamese. And some people were telling me they thought he was really, even though he spoke Khmer, he was probably, again, ethnic Vietnamese. But I'm talking to some more people, I'm convinced that he was actually born 𝐻𝐻𝐿. But here we have a case of someone who, at least for public context, seems to identify, or it's the preference of his temple that he identify more as kin, as his temple is ethnic Khmer, ethnic Vietnamese, Theravada, Buddhist, which is a whole different category, a whole different fascinating topic. And so this sort of gives you a sense of some of the complexities of these issues. And so I think it's time to stop and open it up to questions. And so I will finish my presentation at that. So.
Thanks so much, Professor John Marston. That's very impressive. So it's now time for the Q&A. So I would start with the first question in the chat, so by order. So please feel free to put down your question in the Q&A box. And if some of you want to speak directly with the speaker, so please use the raise hand function, then we can unmute you. Okay, after we finish these three responses in the Q&A box. So the first is the two monks are identified hybridized identities. How do they identify themselves? So I guess Dr. Tuntiara respond to the first question, but do you want to have other responses to the first question of this, John Marston?
Well, I would say that they came to identify themselves as Khmer. And we don't know, there's some give and take. There's some, I don't know if we ever have any evidence that they enthusiastically identified as Thai or as Vietnamese in the case of 𝐀𝐻𝐿. But what we know is that Mahaprasad had a Thai passport, and he was identified as Thai for official purposes. And I think he probably had no problem with that. But for whatever the reason, there seems to be a transition. And whether because of personal conflict or because just sort of a assertion of his long-standing sense of identity, which he wanted to be recognized. Eventually, he asserted his Cambodian identity more and more, and to the point that he was able to acquire a Cambodian passport in the 1990s, which he didn't have before. I think Moksapal again, I'm just reading between the lines. Obviously, he has a child. Well, I mean, as a teenager, he went to Cambodia, which to me says that even though his mother was Vietnamese, that he felt sufficiently Khmer that he went to Cambodia feeling like he had to realize that side of his identity. And perhaps he knew that he could only be educated in the Buddhist tradition in Cambodia, which is often the case for Khmer Krom young men who feel like they cannot pursue education sufficiently in Vietnam, and so they go to Cambodia where they can get a Buddhist education. And yet we see some sort of psychological complexity there that Moksapal, again, of course, I've never met these people, and I'm projecting, they capture my imagination, but it's all projection on my part. I feel like the very fact that he left Cambodia suggested that in some sense he didn't feel at home in Cambodia either. He felt like he needed to go someplace that transcended his Khmer Vietnamese identity, and that it had something to do with the fact that he went to India. And at times it was convenient for him to speak Vietnamese, to use his Vietnamese for work. When he was at Navadalanda Mahavihara, and we don't know how long he was actually there, he did not get a degree there. It was probably natural for him to be friendly with Vietnamese monks as well as Cambodian monks. And that probably had something to do with the fact that he was involved in this protest. But it's a lot of speculation on our part. There's not that much documentation, but what we know is that in the end, and Moksapal also, I thought as soon as the Cambodian temple was created, he moved to the Cambodian temple in Bodh Gaya. But talking to someone yesterday, I learned that actually he stayed at the Burmese temple for a while because that's where he was already living. And it was only the last 3 years of his life that he finally moved to the Cambodian temple. But so obviously his Cambodian identity was important to him. In the end, he reordained as a monk. That was obviously, in a way, even when he left the monkhood, he still, whether he identified as a Cambodian monk, that's the question, but he identified as a Theravada monk. And that seemed that even when he was not a monk, he sort of acted like a monk. And then in the end, he chose to be at the Cambodian temple. And so that's, I think, is an indication that ultimately that his Khmer identity was more important. But what I would emphasize is that there's give and take. That what's interesting to me is not, he was Khmer, but sometimes he had to be in Vietnam. But what's interesting is that people can use different categories as they negotiate their identity. It's not always a clear-cut thing. That's where I'm coming from in this analysis.
Okay, so the next question: did the Indian government ever offer residency or citizenship to the exiled monks?
Well, they didn't offer. I mean, they were able to stay there as refugees. I think there are only a few monks chose to stay in India, but they weren't kicked out. With refugee status, they could stay. But the ones who got Indian citizenship, like from what I've heard in the case of Sophal, and I think this is also true of Sambay, they had to struggle to get it. That there was a lot of bureaucracy. It was not an easy process. It might have been easier then than it is now. I know there are some Cambodian monks living in India now who would like to become Indian citizens, but they found it's not easy to get the citizenship for various reasons. So the Indian government did not just open up an easy path to citizenship, but some of them were able to get it. And it seems to have been not too problematic then or now for Cambodian monks to stay long periods of time in India, even if they're not Indian citizens.
All right. Thank you so much. And the previous question was asked by Cliff Sloan. So thank you so much for that.
Okay, yeah.
The next, it's the eulogy from your close colleague, but she needed to leave from the meeting. So thanks from Professor Elizabeth Guthrie. Thanks for the excellent talk. I have to go now, but looking forward to reading that book. So, and the next question from Colin Grafton. Who was the third monk you wanted to talk about, apart from the main two monks from 𝐀𝐻𝐭?
No, there were the three 𝐀𝐻𝐿 monks, which I did talk about briefly at the end, and I would have liked to. I originally planned to talk a bit more about them, but they were the two monks I'm primarily talking about today were Daprasud and Moksapal. And then because of their cases raise some of the same issues, although I don't have the same control of their lives, then these other three 𝐻𝐿 monks are worth mentioning passing. That is, say, Tat Sung, Tat Thai, and 𝐀𝐻𝐿. And 𝐀𝐻𝐿 actually, I'm just learning about 𝐀𝐻𝐿. There actually is quite a lot of written about 𝐀𝐻𝐿, who was quite an accomplished monk who founded temples in the United States and is highly respected. But the question is, he's generally identified as Vietnamese and not Khmer. And so to what extent is he part of our topic? But to me, he's part of our topic in the fact that it's interesting the degree to which these categories are up for discussion.
All right. So the next one is from my advisor, Professor Ann Hansen. And you would like to speak with John, so I can unmute you.
Okay.
Yes. Wait, can I unmute you? Wait a moment. Tandy. All right. So please feel free to address your question.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
John,
Hi, Ann.
Hi. This was so fascinating. There's so much here that I'm interested in, but I'm just wondering, it's really striking that you have all these really educated monks and they're not publishing, they're not writing, because there's so much intellectual production, especially in the 1950s and early 60s in Cambodia. So I just wonder, for instance, did you get a hold of Moksapal's dissertation on message poetry? Are some of those right? And do you have any thoughts about why they're not publishing, what the challenges might have been, or are they simply monks who are more interested in building because they're doing a lot of building? So is that, how they're trying to, spread their ideas and their influence rather than through publishing?
Well, each case is a little bit different. I don't think 𝐀𝐿𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐜 ever published anything in his lifetime. And then when I was interviewed actually it was like almost 10 years ago that I interviewed his grandnephew, and then who was in Phnom Penh at the time. He had been a novice, and then he left the monkhood briefly and was going to ordain as a bhikkhu. And his family apparently lived in Tultapong, although I interviewed him at Wat Unalam. And then later on I had his email contact, and I wrote him and I said, well, do you know the name of his thesis? And he wrote back right away with the title. And then now I'm thinking that he had that title because he was at his family's home, and they have a copy of the thesis. And then I was not smart enough to try to get a copy at that time. And now I've been trying to locate the nephew, and I haven't been able to. So, but no, it wasn't published. Some of the Cambodians who studied in India did publish. One of them had a book published in India about the Angkorian period based on a master's thesis. The case of Sambe, who you've seen in the picture, Sambe was, he also had a doctorate, and his doctorate is available, actually, I think, in our little reading group that we read some sections from Sambe's thesis, which is quite fascinating because it was politically to the left at the time of the Khmer Rouge period when he was trying to combine certain leftist ideas with writing about Cambodian Buddhism. It was quite fascinating, a little strange. And then what I'm told is that Sambe did have a lot of writing, which when he died was there. And again, I refer to Tat Bun Ton, who through the website Look at Vidu has access and put online some of this kind of material. But no, they didn't publish. Most of them did not. They were intellectuals, and that's part of what's fascinating about these groups, because because they were intellectuals. I mean, I'm talking to 𝐀𝐿𝐵𝐴, who's of the four is still alive, and I don't think is watching today, but could even be. And he has an incredible memory, and he was involved in politics and a lot of things over the years. And clearly he was someone who was fascinated by ideas, but I don't think ever published. So, in individual cases, some of the monks who studied in India do have some writing associated with them, although less than we might like.
Well, thanks so much, 𝐀𝐿𝐿𝐿. So the next question would be from 𝐾 Bun Ton. Okay, hold on, Venerable Sophia. You are next after 𝐾 Bun Ton. 𝐾 Bun Ton from CDRI. Thank you so much, Professor John Marston, for illuminatingly telling the stories of the two other Khmer monks who studied in India in the pre-75. To me, the interesting part of the talk today is the first two Khmer monks, one Lokta Prasad, holding a Thai passport, thus Thai citizenship, another hailing from Cambodia, Venerable Sophal. But at the end of their life, they comfortably identify themselves as Khmer and continue to be associated with Cambodians at large. My question concerned with the methodology. You largely rely on interviews with key informants for data collection. How do you ensure that the information is accurate and reliable as possible? We would like to learn from your research technique.
Well, yes, and thank you, Kapanton, who is the person who has helped me a lot in this whole process, and who I made some changes based on conversation with him yesterday. And but the whole question of research based on interviews is, you know, you always hope you get more than one source, and I am guilty of sometimes putting into publications things that are based on a single interview. Although if you can, you know, you try to have as many interviews as you can, and but it is a problem actually in the case of Mutable that especially not all of the interviews have been consistent, like that the order of the schools where he studied, some people say he studied here first, then here first, then another place. Other people reverse the order. I believe that I have more than one interviewee telling me where he was born in Vietnam, and I've stated Chao Duc because that was what his grandnephew told me, and I would think the family would know better than anyone else. But there are, to some extent, you have to try to be consistent. You have to be as rigorous as you can, and then sometimes you follow your intuitions that this is true or this is not true. And but definitely oral history has its limitations, and I'm always happy when there's a document. And as I told you that it was Kapanton who, when I first went to India and I met 𝐀𝐻𝐿𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐜𝐭 and Sambe at that time, and they told me about Taprasud, all these fascinating things, and they told me there was a book, a cremation volume, and I wanted to get a copy, and they said, oh, they couldn't find it, and then finally, but I interviewed several people. I think I got the general outline of his life, and what I got from interview was accurate. But then when I finally got, thanks to Kapanton, I got the book, then, and the book may, you know, it may have some inaccuracies as well, but the fact that it's a document, then it is definitely it's something much more concrete than we have otherwise. So definitely we look for documents when we can find them. But the interviews are, we can learn a lot from interviews as well. So
Thank you so much. And I guess I recently saw Venerable 𝐾𝐻𝐿𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐜𝐭 raise his hand, so I would like to allow him to speak with the speaker. So please feel free to unmute yourself, Venerable 𝐾𝐻𝐿𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐜𝐭.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
good to hear from you too. We have the Wisconsin contingent here, so
Yeah. And I hope to see you here. Well,
yes.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I have a lot of questions actually, but because I've encountered with many monks in Singapore, and many of them associated with many Cambodian monks who were traveling to India, and quite a number of them returned back before during the Khmer Rouge took over, and then many of them returned back to Cambodia and get executed. But quite a number of those monks stranded in Singapore, and they built many temples over there. And then I was fortunate enough to participate to the oldest monk who passed away. His name is 𝐀𝐀𝐬𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐜𝐭. He's from Kampong Cham, and he lives in Wat Chuk. I think maybe you're probably familiar with the temple in Ao, close to Ao.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so he told me I through his because I live with the Singaporean monk. So and then I met another monk from Posat province. He also went to India and then ended up back in Malaysia right now. So I want to learn if you can through your connection. So how did those monks get the funding? I mean, like they, for quite numbers that they told me that they get different sponsorship from different. Some of them got from government, some got from I don't know. I'm not quite sure, but if you can help.
Yes, well, I mean, we're talking about the pre-Pol Pot period. I mean, now there are monks going to India now, and they have their, there's a whole well, I have an article, but it's only been published in Spanish, about the role of the Asia Foundation in supporting Cambodian monks who went to India in the 50s and into the beginning of the 1960s. And so there were these associations in Cambodia, the Friends of the Pali Society and the World and then an association affiliated with the World Fellowship of Buddhists. And so they were able to sponsor some monks on their own, but sometimes they use money from the Asia Foundation to send monks to India to study. And this had to do with the Asia Foundation, we now understand more clearly than before, was linked to the US government, in fact, to the CIA. And although I feel like when I write about this, it's always so sensational when you mention the CIA. But in this case, what they were doing was fairly, it wasn't so bad, it wasn't so malign, what's the word for it? But the CIA was basically helping Cambodian monks get funding to go to study in India. And the reason they were doing this was because they believed that building up Buddhism would protect Cambodia from communism. So in the and there were other monks who, for one reason or another, were able to go by themselves. And then in the 60s, and the US, the Asia, even when Sihanouk kicked out all the other US agencies, they continued to keep the Asia Foundation in Cambodia because the director was a good guy, and because the Asia Foundation was helping people financially. And then finally they discovered they kicked the Asia Foundation out as well. And then reports began to rise of the Asia Foundation's links to the CIA. So after a certain point, then the Cambodian monks who were going to India were getting scholarships from the Indian government. And the monks who went from Cambodia to, well, even in the 50s, like Mahago Sananda originally did get some funding through Friends of the Pali Association, but the funding came from the Asia Foundation. And the Asia Foundation decided, this was at Navanalanda Mahavihara, it relates to this hunger strike because the monks in the hunger strike, which I mentioned, were from, identified in the articles coming from Navanalanda Mahavihara. And the US back in 1958, the Asia Foundation had cut off fundings because they believed that Nalanda Mahavihara was communist infiltrated, even though it wasn't really. And at that time, Mahagosananda lost his funding from the Asia Foundation, but very quickly was able to get a scholarship from the Indian government. And after the mid-60s, there was no longer funding from the Asia Foundation. The Asia Foundation no longer was allowed in Cambodia. And I think some monks did have family support for going to India, but at a certain point, most of the Cambodian monks who went, like in the early 70s, had scholarships from the Indian government. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's a fascinating story I've learned. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Venerable Kaisapia. So the next one will be a question from Dr. Tuntira. So thank you, Professor Marston, for your rich and insightful presentation. I have a brief question. Did Mahaprasad play any significant role in Theravada Buddhist communities outside India? And did he instruct any Khmer monks who subsequently returned to Cambodia?
Well, I would like to know more about his links to Thailand. And, during the first years, he created his first temple in Sravasti. It was largely funded from Wat Po in Thailand. So he had significant links to Thailand, and many Thai pilgrims and Thai monks who went to India were in contact with him. He had this connection to a Thai monk from Wat Mahathat, was associated as a meditation teacher, and he himself practiced meditation. Whether he was exactly a teacher, I don't know. He's not generally identified as a teacher, although he was connected with other monks who were teachers of meditation. So he had these links to the Thai Theravada world, and although eventually he began to emphasize his Cambodian identity, and he did, possibly, again, from my interviews, it's hard to know that one of the issues was that he wanted to do fundraising outside of India, and the Thais were less likely to support that, and the Cambodian embassy was more likely to support that, and that may have been the reason why. And the Cambodian embassy gave him a diplomatic passport, and that may have been one of the reasons why he shifted the identity of his temples to Cambodian identity. He did, at the end of his life, he did go back to Cambodia on several occasions. I think largely for fundraising purposes. Moksapal also, once he became an Indian citizen, he also went back to Cambodia, the first time as a lay person, and then once he reordained as a monk, he went to Cambodia as a monk near the end of his life at least 2 more times.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tuntira, for your question. And the next one is from Colin Crafton again. When was he staying in the Burmese temple in Bodh Gaya?
When was
he staying in the Burmese temple in Bodh Gaya?
We're talking about Moksapal. I think two different sources have different dates, but I believe he I believe he reordained in 2001. And then, and he reordained, when he reordained, his preceptor was Burmese and Bodh Gaya. And then he stayed there. I thought he only stayed in the Burmese temple until the Cambodian temple was operational in 2004, but someone I talked to yesterday told me that actually he stayed at the Burmese temple until 2010. So he was at the Burmese temple perhaps from 2001 to 2010.
Thank you so much. So the next question from Lord Savanna. According to your research recently, how many monks were there that studied at Navanalanda Mahavihara since 1963 to now, until now?
Well, the first monks who were there were in the 50s. And I don't have the total number of Khmer monks whose names I've been able to get, who studied at in India in the pre-75 period or who studied or were otherwise present in some ways. I have 34 names. And I'd have to check my data for how many of them actually studied at Navanalanda Mahavihara. And on my last trip to India, I was able to get a printout of a sort of an Excel sheet giving the names of all these foreign students who were at Navanalanda Mahavihara at the time. So if that's accurate, then we have the names. I think there might have been like around 10, I would guess, or a little less, but that's just my guess. But approximately, there were several anyway.
Thank you so much for that. And the next two statements are from your Kalayana Mitras. So the first one from John Weeks, no questions, just want to say thanks for the presentation. Fun to get deep into the details.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the next one from Professor Judy Ledgerwood, I need to leave. Thanks for the wonderful presentation.
Okay, and thank you. It's nice to know. I did at one point check the participants list, but I don't know if everyone are on there, but I'm really happy to see all these people I know in attendance by web, and thank you all for attending. Yes. So,
but before we leave, I would like to take advantage of being a moderator.
Yes.
Put something, as I have a privilege to read your paper before your presentation.
No, I'm very
I
interested.
have so many things. I have so many things.
Well, we have to talk sometime because I'm really interested in what you would say. And your research is also on border issues, but so yeah.
Yes, but quickly for the last thing I would like to say is that I was fascinated when reading about the story of 𝐀𝐻𝐬𝐭𝐫𝐚𝐜𝐭, right? The
Right, yeah.
Vietnamese identified monk, the monk who identified himself or being identified as Vietnamese, because to me it's very obvious that his name sounds Teochew, because Kim is a Teochew family name. Teochew is obviously
Okay,
Teochew.
well, anyway,
So basically Sino-Vietnamese.
what you don't know is that the version I sent to you, that's the one section that has changed, and then I rushed through that. But the more I talk to more people, the more contradictory information about Kim through. And I've been told that Kim is one of the names, that it is one of the surnames used by Khmer Krom in Vietnam. And although then one of the person I've been in touch with is Pascal Bordeaux, who's a specialist on Ken, on ethnic Vietnamese Theravada Buddhism in Vietnam, which is only a small minority of the Vietnamese Buddhists are are Theravada. You know, most Theravada Buddhism in Vietnam is Khmer. But there is this small ethnically Vietnamese Theravada community, and Pascal Bardot has done research on that topic, and other scholars have done research on that topic as well. And he actually met with Vietnamese monk in Paris who is from this Theravada tradition and who had actually studied with Kim Tru in Thailand, and he said that this monkey interview said Kim Tru had never made any reference to being Khmer, but they all agreed that he was probably a mixture of ethnic Vietnamese, ethnic Chinese, and ethnic Khmer. And now only recently, I don't think he's in attendance, been in touch with another highly educated Khmer monk who also studied in India, and he had met Kim Tru just briefly in India, but with a group of Khmer monks, and he said he's absolutely Khmer. And so, but yeah, I agree. These things are complex. That, like in the case, even in the case of Sophal, his mother was Vietnamese, so it's not as though both his parents were Khmer. And there are some people who are more clearly Khmer than others, and I think Kim Tru is clearly, he had a very sophisticated Vietnamese language education, and it's legitimate to say that he is in some significant way has a Vietnamese identity, and yet he seems to have been, since he was a child, spoken Khmer, and in some sense identified Khmer since he was a child. And so in a way, these cases where it gets complicated, those are the cases that are most interesting to me, that where it's not clear cut, and that sometimes it just is not clear cut.
Thank you so much. And that even reaffirmed your arguments about the ambiguous identities, right? And mutable
So yeah.
nationalities. And before we end, I would like to read the two more statements here. First one from Professor Ann Hansen. This was such a rich presentation, John. Thank you. I would love to read the full paper. I totally agree with this. I would love to read when it's turned into the publication, and can't wait to see you next week. And another anonymous attendee, thanks for your kind and wonderful presentation. So I hope to see you again at India.
Okay. Well, this is great. So, and thank you once again. Thanks for attending, and thanks for moderating, Ike. And I'm glad this could happen. So.
Thanks so much, everyone. Professor John Marston, who gave a wonderful talk for today, and especially special thanks to the Center for Khmer Studies and every one of you who participate in this wonderful webinar. And I hope to see you again, or we hope to see you again in the next events of CKS. And please take care, and hope to see you in the future events. Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay, great. Okay. Bye, everybody.